Hi, it's Patrick Hutzel from IntensiveCareHotline.com, where we instantly improve the lives of families of critically ill patients in intensive care, so that you can have real power, real control, and so that you can influence decision making fast, even if you're not a doctor or a nurse in intensive care. In last week's blog, I've shown you how believing in yourself will help you to have control, power and influence whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. You can read, watch or listen to the update if you click on the link below this video. In this week's blog, I want to show you the 3 phrases you must always use if your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. It's very easy to get bogged down if one of your family members has just been admitted to intensive care for critical illness. It's even easier to get overwhelmed by negative emotion if your loved one has just been admitted to intensive care. And it's a big problem for families of critically ill patients in intensive care. And it's a problem that is so big that families of critically ill patients don't know left from right and don't know right from wrong when it happens. The negative emotions and the feeling of powerlessness, the loss of control and the feeling of having no influence whatsoever whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care usually goes hand in hand with the feeling of overwhelm, fear, frustration, struggle and the feeling of vulnerability. It also makes it very easy for the intensive care team to drive the bus and present your critically ill loved one's prognosis and diagnosis in a light that suits the intensive care team's agenda and may or may not represent reality. If your critically ill loved one is a quote-unquote straightforward admission to intensive care and is soon to be discharged from intensive care, that's great news. And you can probably stop watching or listening here now, because what I am about to share applies more to families where their critically ill loved one is either dying, very unstable and in a really critical condition, very unstable and on the brink of dying, stable but a long-term stay in intensive care may be on the horizon, unstable and a long-term stay in intensive care may be on the horizon, or is already a long-term patient in intensive care. In essence, what I am about to share is for any family member of a critically ill patient in intensive care who is not a quote-unquote straightforward patient and who is in intensive care with an uncertain short-term or long-term future. Therefore, you and your family need to get back on track and you need to take charge and control of the situation immediately. The reality is that there are so many moving parts behind the scenes in intensive care that you have no idea and insights about, and if you don't educate yourself quickly, it's very easy for the intensive care team to drive their agenda, especially if your loved one falls into one of the categories that I mentioned before. In more than 15 years intensive care nursing in 3 different countries, I have found that 99% of families of critically ill patients in intensive care are generally so overwhelmed by fear, frustration, struggle and vulnerability that the last thing on their mind is that they can take control, have power and influence in the situation, because they have this misconception that the intensive care team holds all the power. And the intensive care team holds all the power if you let them and if you think that they have all the power. The next big challenge for families of critically ill patients is that they don't educate themselves about intensive care, and it's therefore very easy for the intensive care team to drive their agenda and position themselves and your critically ill loved one's prognosis and diagnosis in a light that suits the intensive care team. Your job therefore is to position yourself and your family correctly in such a challenging and often once-in-a-lifetime situation. Therefore, I want to give you 3 power phrases that you must always use whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. Number 1. I am or we are able to take control of the situation no matter what. Listen, it's so easy to get frustrated and overwhelmed by this challenge, and it's even easier to put all your trust in the intensive care team. But if you are facing a massive challenge like the ones I mentioned above, where your loved one is dying, or at least the intensive care team is telling you that your critically ill loved one is dying, or if the intensive care team is telling you that your critically ill loved one may have to stay in intensive care for long periods of time with an uncertain outcome, you better find out whether they are telling you the truth. The reality is that in a billion-dollar industry such as intensive care, the intensive care team will always have an agenda, whether it's their research interests, which equals $1 million funding source, whether it's bed management, whether it's a staffing crisis, and or the intensive care unit's budget. Your job is to make sure that you take control of the situation by asking the right questions, by challenging the intensive care team, and by believing that you can have control, power, and influence. Phrase number 2. I am or we are able to have power in this challenging situation, no matter what. If you are, like 99% of families of critically ill patients in intensive care, you think that the intensive care team is powerful, and you therefore think that you and your family have no power in this situation whatsoever. If you are, like 99% of families of critically ill patients, you also put the intensive care team on a pedestal, and you tend to suck up to them, and you think that they must be really smart. If you hopefully belong to the 1% of families of critically ill patients in intensive care who have control, power, and influence, you have hopefully already challenged the assumption that the intensive care team has all the power, and you have hopefully challenged your own assumptions about your own ability to have control, power, and influence in this challenging situation. Because the reality is that if you think that you have control, power, and influence, you probably do. Therefore, stop sucking up to the intensive care team and drive your own agenda instead. See what happens. I bet the intensive care team won't like it. I also bet that if they don't like it, they have something to hide, or they are so used to not have families challenge them that they can't deal with the situation. The reality is that if you start challenging the intensive care team, and if you start asking the right questions, you will have control, power, and influence, and you immediately set yourself apart from 99% of families of critically ill patients who don't have control, power, and influence. You will also see the dynamics shift in your favor immediately. You can trust me on this one. Phrase number 3. I am or we are able to have influence in this challenging and often once-in-a-lifetime situation. Again, if you are like 99% of families of critically ill patients in intensive care, you feel like you have no or very little influence in this challenging and often once-in-a-lifetime situation. Think about it. Thankfully, it's not very often that one of your family members gets admitted to intensive care. But if you and your family have found yourself in this challenging situation, you don't want to leave things up to the intensive care team alone. Your input and your level of influence is crucial, especially if the intensive care team hasn't told you any good news, and especially if you feel like things are getting out of control. Once again, if the intensive care team has told you that your critically ill loved one is either dying, very unstable and in a really critical condition, very unstable and on the brink of dying, stable but a long-term stay in intensive care may be on the horizon, unstable and a long-term stay in intensive care may be on the horizon, or is already or is becoming a long-term patient in intensive care. Your job is to question whether the intensive care team's very assumptions, and you quickly need to find out whether they are telling you the truth or whether there are other moving parts and other motives driving their agenda, such as research activities, bed management, the intensive care team's budget, staffing issues, and or any other competing interests. How do you do that? And how do you educate yourself quickly, succinctly, and efficiently so that you have control, power, and influence? Well, I'm glad you've asked, because here it is. You'll get to that all-important feeling of power, control, and influence when you download your free Instant Impact Report now by entering your email below. In your free Instant Impact Report, you learn quickly how to get real power and real control, and how you can influence decision making fast whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. Your free Instant Impact Report gives you in-depth insight that you must know whilst your loved one is critically ill or is dying in intensive care. Sign up and download your free Instant Impact Report now by entering your email below. In your free Instant Impact Report, you learn how to speak the secret intensive care language so that the doctors and the nurses know straight away that you are an insider and that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care. In your free report, you'll also discover how to ask the doctors and the nurses the right questions, how to eliminate fear, frustration, stress, struggle, and vulnerability even if your loved one is dying. You get 5 killer tips and strategies helping you to get on the right path to control, power, and influence in your situation. You'll get crucial behind-the-scenes insight so that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care, and how you need to manage doctors and nurses in intensive care, and it's not what you think. Thank you for tuning into this week's blog, and I'll see you again in another update next week. Make sure you also check out our Your Questions Answered section, where we answer your questions, or send me an email to support@intensivecarehotline.com with your questions. This is Patrick Hutzel from intensivecarehotline.com, and I'll see you again next week in another update.